In the long story of how humankind conquered the galaxy, we need only concern ourselves with the part where everything went very wrong. Okay, the third time where everything went very wrong. Humanity once overcame the near destruction of Earth and its lively moon by discovering how to fix up planets with huge machines. Humanity once overcame the dilution of civilization in the miserable days of the new colonial rimworlds by inventing faster-than-light gateways to connect all peoples together in glorious iron-fisted harmony. Things were looking rather good. But one day, the gates stopped working, leaving humans all over the galaxy suddenly trapped with each other. Disaster doesn't begin to describe it, and neither shall I, for the business of our story already begins apace somewhere in space. Imagine you are looking out over the blue-as-paint seas of the planet Volturn. It's all sea, so I suppose you are floating in it, alongside all the officials of the largest diplomatic conference that the Perseus sector had ever known. What was this conference about? Look up at the sky. There's a tiny speck shining up there. That speck had just become the most important thing in the entire sector. Spectial. Yes, let's look inside, shall we? On the time-worn bridge of a square-built Venture-class cruiser, a man was gripping the captain's chair from behind and squeezing its flaking red leather like he was giving it a back rub. "It smells of whiskey," he noted. A flash on his visor stowed that note away for safekeeping. His head was covered in lights and gizmos, obscuring his matted grey locks and wide, deceptively cheerful face. He turned to the smartly dressed lady beside him. She pulsed to life, realizing her client had said something. Yes, vintage design, of course. And that you can just bathe in the history behind it," she explained. Right, you don't need to sell it to me," the man joked, but the woman disagreed with fiery passion. Hence she toured the bridge, justifying the disrepair and old age of all its components. Her charm was practiced and positively inhuman. The man stood and watched in a bemused fashion, wondering when he should cut in and tell her why he was here. "Only one previous owner," she almost cheered. "And what happened to them?" "Oh, I think they died." "Right. No fault of the ship, I presume?" No, not at all. It was very much self-inflicted," the lady said, with the hardest working smile in the business. "Roger that," the man said. The captain's chair was getting the massage of its life by this point. "So, you're interested in buying?" she probed, her tripad in hand ready to sup on a signature. "It's the government. Governments. I'm just a volunteer prisoner, shall we say." "Oh, how lovely for you. And which government are you representing?" "All of them. The Interfactional Exploration Concern. Or was it Interim Exo-Sector Coalition? Something like that." Right. Obviously that's not a real thing, so I won't be able to put that down. Shall I just take your name?" The woman smoothly smiled. "It is a real thing. It's supposed to save us," the man said, struggling to convince himself. "If it's really not all paid for, ask our treasurer." "Oh, a treasurer? That sounds very exciting," the lady said. Her sincerity could create a singularity if she wasn't careful. "Contreras," the man called. The bridge door wheezed open, and a narrow woman in a slab of black corporation-class synth fibers stormed in, with a tripod balanced on each hand like she was a waitress. She strode up to within headbutting distance of the man and reported, "Captain Ryman, we have spent 468 credits on oxygen while waiting to depart. We should expedite departure and jettison approximately 73 kilograms of cargo to recoup our losses in fuel costs." "Roger that, Lieutenant. You've clearly cooked us a whole course, so let's be on it. Shall I address the crew?" Ryman said. "No. Do you even know what uses oxygen and what doesn't? You must follow the budgetary guidelines in the IEC Charter," Contreras scowled. Ryman's gut feeling about her back on Volturn had been dead right. She was the kind of trouble that might actually make this mission possible. Rather than ask what this charter he was only just hearing about actually was, he said, "Understood. Then you have the bridge, Lieutenant." He slumped down to lean on that whiskey-scented seat, flashing himself a smile. He loved saying captainly things like, "You have the bridge." It made him feel like a big shot. And he was a big shot again now. He could hardly believe that this was his punishment for the bad thing he did. We'll get to that later. Contreras snapped her fingers. Immediately, people flooded the room and took up their positions, and everything was noise, motion, and spacer-like choreography. "Launch codes are authorized," a neat woman seated beside the captain's chair said. "Roger, Lieutenant Olympus. Clear all comms and ping the beacons," Contreras said. "I never get to ping beacons," Olympus said with a joyous smile. Well, maybe if you'd pinged a beacon, you'd share her joy. Perhaps not appreciating this light techno-babble was the sales lady. She repeatedly raised her voice in growing alarm. But no, Contreras hadn't forgotten about her. All 73 kilograms of her. Lieutenant Titanian, Contreras summoned. A skeletal giant of a man stepped up from beside the door. "Please jettison this unauthorized passenger." "Aye aye," came the grunt that sealed the poor lady's fate. Scrambling did her no good, held aloft like some giant imperiled beetle. "You're criminals!" she screamed. Ryman sighed. "We're not criminals. We're from the government," he quipped, and thus, as a pod of second-hand spaceship scammer rocketed down towards gleaming Volturn, the twin engines of the IECS Gargandua roared to life. From far below, it was a mere speck of light in the maddeningly blue sky. Far above, in the higher dimension that overshadows all of reality, it looked just the same. And be certain that someone up there was watching, but let's keep to the matters at hand for now. The salvation of the lost peoples of the Perseus sector had begun. Or had it? Ryman had been wrestling with such questions throughout the long briefing from his new masters in the interfactional whatever it was called. Let's bring you up to speed with the quick version. The Perseus sector was a tight cluster of stars in a relatively backwater chunk of our erstwhile galaxy. In the grand scheme of things, it was a newly colonized human territory. In the less grand and significantly more important scheme of things, it was a wasteland ravaged by the brutal wars that followed that business with the interstellar gate network breaking down. For some time, people had tried to fix it, but like a printer throwing a fit because you fed it ink manufactured by the wrong company, these gates were immovably unproductive. Then things started blowing up. Not for any good reason, mark you. It simply seemed that if the sector was stuck with only the scraps of civilization it had managed to cultivate up to then the only way to get ahead in life was to take what you could of said scraps. For 200 old Earth years, cycles as people called them, the big players and polities of Perseus turned their futuristic industries to war. We'll get into some details later. For now, know only that the end result of the 200 Years' War was a sector in which some 95% of the original colonial space had been abandoned, and a few million people now huddled together with the last of their decaying tech in the so-called core worlds. At some point, the governments noted that things were going poorly in that blasted grand scheme I keep gesturing at, and they had a clever idea: not killing off the final 5% of the population. How? Leading political philosophers had developed a new social order to govern relations between humanity's many leaders, known as peace. This peace involved primarily not killing each other. But if you leave people alone in so-called peace for long enough, they always do start killing each other eventually. Peace is boring and always just seems unfair to all involved in one way or another. This new paradigm needed one more ingredient. It needed something for the peacemakers to actually do, something that had promise of a brighter tomorrow. They called this new idea hope. Now they were onto something. After years of bickering about menus and seating plans, the many factions of the Perseus sector were convinced to have a sit-down meeting to discuss peace and hope. It was agreed that they were very, very good ideas. It was also agreed that no one in their right mind would spend a single space penny to achieve them. And such was the creed of the ambiguously animated IEC. This collection of bureaucrats was to draw the best and brightest prison labour from all the factions of the sector, and throw it into some sort of thing that made the governments look like they were forging a better future by venturing out into the wastelands of space and tidying things up a little perhaps. The details were strategically sparse. As long as it paid its own way, and no one signing the treaty had to actually do anything themselves, it all sounded very agreeable. A few butterfly wing beats later, Ryman was the captain of the new/second-hand IEC Expeditionary Fleet. There, now you know about as much about what's going on as he did. After all this exposition, Ryman was expected to explain it to his crew. He sat in his chair. It was still warm, almost alarmingly so. Ignore that, ignore everything, the professor is back at the lectern. He grabbed the mic. I am Noah Dahl Ryman, professor of hyperspatial topography at the Galatia Academy. Fired, arrested, and so on. I have been given the honor of being humanity's first peace and hope officer, or Pope for short. But you can call me Captain because this is a ship. Don't worry, I've done this before. Narrator's note. Ryman wasn't even lying here, even though he could have done. He was a good man, really. His lawyer was adamant about it. You are probably wondering why you're all here. More than usual, I mean. For me, it's a tale as old as time. My parole officer told me to show up. Looking around the room, I'm seeing nods, yes, okay, so that's cleared something up. I thought it was strange they would give me command after the rather unfair way my trial was conducted, but perhaps it was just because everyone else here did things even worse. What did I do? Well, technically I didn't do anything yet, because those students I lost may yet return from hyperspace. Let me know if you see any Academy shuttles on your travels, would you all? You'll recognize the students, very growly, good with rhymes that insult you for problems you didn't even know you had until the final syllable smacks you around the face with Lud's honest truth. Deserving of exile to the depths of hyperspace, some lawyers have attempted to argue in recent weeks. Yes, so what are we doing? We, my good fellows in bonds, are here by the graces of every single government in this sector, even the ones that think we should all kill ourselves for the good of the universe. But I repeat myself, our goal is simple. To come up with a goal. I don't know. Look, they wanted us to go and piece together some kind of report on the viability of rebuilding civilization in the sector. Really pushing against the tide of history there, aren't we? I don't imagine it will be possible, or that many of us will survive 10 minutes into the old sector, but don't let that get you down. I think we're being paid, should be able to confirm that, and I wish to inspire you all to feel happy, confident, and obedient, and great with authority figures who've got better things to do than talk to you. And is this really necessary? Ryman was actually quite good at public speaking. He had lectured at the Galatian Academy for 10 cycles in community service and 10 more as genuine paid staff. He knew all the ropes of talking to people who really didn't want to be there. His shaken delivery was caused by Lieutenant Contreras. She had moved up behind him so closely that Ryman didn't have room so much as to quiver. But don't get the wrong idea. The only sweet nothing she whispered into his ear was something about syllables with poor water vapor efficiency. She had an arm curled around him to hold a toothbrush-like monitoring device in front of his mouth, and Ryman could swear that she was gently blowing around his cheek to get more of his own exhalation to pass over the hairs on the receiver. This was, to put it lightly, the most distracting thing that has ever happened to anyone, so please cut Ryman some slack. And I am reminded to request that you all please keep your breathing to a strict minimum, he announced. And no sex parties, Contreras was quick to add, speaking directly into Ryman's mouth to make sure she was just as loud and clear as he was. That's probably how that worked, right? Ryman was frozen to the spot by emotions and thoughts that escaped description, but eventually parroted, "Okay, no sex parties." "Can we get refunds for our tickets?" Alison Olympus asked, spinning around with a mop of thin paper strips brandished aloft. "Who sold you those, and how many did you buy?" Ryman asked. Olympus opened her mouth to respond, but Contreras' glare ensured all that came out was a strictly regulation volume of carbon dioxide-rich air. Alas, of all the mysteries we shall be investigating on this grand adventure, those of these opening minutes remain as impenetrable and mind-boggling as any other. That will be all. Here's to the maiden voyage of whatever this tin can calls itself, and whatever you scraps of humanity call yourselves. Huzzah!
A brilliant speech, Captain, Olympus reported. Shall I start broadcasting now?
You weren't broadcasting, Ryman said, finding himself taking the familiar "I am not going to kill you, you stupid little insect" tone he was forced to use with his former students. He was going to need that a lot on this venture, I assure you.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were practicing. Let's do it again,
Olympus said with a cheery smile, clean and without regret. Forget it. Launch the ship. Gargandua was it? We'll tell the crew where we're going when we get there.
Captain, be advised that our destination represents a high-priority deliverable in the case of plotting a course, affording liberal use of your symbolic arsenal,
a voice echoing out of Ryman's mouth said. Quite literally, of course, Ryman nodded once he was done coughing, understanding more completely than he'd like to admit. We're going to here. He held up his datapad. Dainty Alison Olympus and hulking Mr. Titanian came over to see. Somewhere in the crushing huddle that formed, Ryman's finger was pointing to a spot that their respective parole officers agreed was an ideal place to begin the investigation into the downfall and potential upfall of wider civilization. It was a dot out in space, similar to the numberless others. But when it comes to investigating grains of sand to see if your ancestors carved their initials into it with tiny lasers, you really do have to start somewhere, don't you? Well, you do when the courts say that's your sentence for involuntary hyperdumping. Speaking of involuntary hyperdumping, once the huddle had dispersed, Ryman smarmily asked Contreras, "Had trouble with sex parties on your last ship?"
"I have had every problem imaginable, Doctor," Contreras reported.
I sympathize. What I meant to say was, ever been to space?
No.
Oh. Well, you'll like it. It's a whole new world of problems.
And I'm going to make all of them your problems, Captain.
Ryman was almost certain he was being flirted with every time Contreras said something. Was he right? As a trained scientist, he knew that such lofty questions would require peer review to approach the truth. But his peers now would be those in the room around him, because he was about to order the Gargandua into the deep, dark depths of space. Space travel was old hat at this late stage in the tale of human civilization, yet there remained a wondrous energy to that feeling of departing on a journey that was statistically going to kill you. And with the time-bending realm of hyperspace getting involved, the phrase "dead before you know it" becomes a gateway to all sorts of eye-opening sights. There's near-death experiences, post-death experiences, reverse-death experiences, and there's the kind of experiences a post-human hands-on accountant like Contreras offered to budding space captains. All signs that something has gone very wrong. Well, with a press-gang ship's crew thoroughly in the dark, and an antimatter engine beginning to whir to life, a great adventure was afoot. The IEC Grand Fleet pushed off from the orbital docks over sweet blue Volturne. The flagship Gargandua, a mining vessel hastily painted to look like a government space cruiser, was joined by a handful of smaller junk carrying food and fuel for a good few years. What, years? Were they really going off for that long without so much as a washing up rotor on the planning table? Yes, but it's hyperspace, you see, so it's all less important than it sounds. And I think everyone was well aware that dying in deep space under a huge pile of washing up was probably a first-rate way to go, all things considered. Hence, with all things decidedly not considered, a massive adventure across the stars begins. One that, believe it or not, would actually prove to be of vital importance to the fate of the sector, nay, the fate of all humanity. Ryman always knew he'd save the universe one day. Save it from what, you ask? Hey, did you hear the anti-conceptual thud of the Gargandua's antimatter drive piercing the veil of reality just now? Something did. Something always does. It's listening very carefully, and so should you, as I tell you the tale of how the universe is going to end.